Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. Now, we just looked at some games of Capablanca and finished off with a brief video about rook endings. And this now takes us onto our next master, Efim Bogoljubov. Now, Reti offers a bit of a precursor to Bogoljubov, just as he does with all of the masters. He says that he was born in Russia, 1889, and was one of the leading players of the time. And he was a key contender for the World Championship title. He was one of the main contenders to try and knock Alekhine and Capablanca off their perch. Now, Reti comments that Bogoljubov was very confident in himself and his ability, and because a lot of chess masters have been able to play a really magnificent game, that the quality of their play didn't always differ that much from master to master. The psychological element of chess, Reti comments, really cannot be understated. Now, Reti also says that an element of chess, which is what we've seen so far, is how you evaluate a position. Originally, you would evaluate a position using Steinertz's more fixed rules of chess in terms of the minor pieces, imbalances, and the pawn structure and things. However, he later explains that, as Nimzowitsch shown, particularly that a position could be evaluated a lot more dynamically, almost improving upon Steinertz's rules of chess. It explains that potentially poor positions, which are more restricted, may still be good if you can get good development and you're able to get a effective plan. And likewise, you may have a lot more space and a lot more freedom, but if you can't get as good development and you can't really improve your position further or get a good plan together, then your position may actually be worse, even though you've got those advantages. And Reti comments that Bogoljubov's games are very dynamic in this nature. And the first game we sort of see almost this hyper-modern style of game turning into a more of a fixed game, one that has more characteristics of Steinertz's rules of chess. So we see d4, knight f6, c4, e6. So we're going into almost potentially an Indian defense, but d5 could still be played. Knight f3, c5. We then see knight to c3. Now, Reti comments that d5 is likely the better move. However, here Alekhine had introduced b5, the Blumenfeld counter gambit. And that was still sort of under consideration. People hadn't really figured out the opening that well yet. It wasn't too clear whether it was a good opening or a bad opening. But knight c3 is what was played in this game. We have c takes d4, knight takes d4, and now bishop to b4. And here Bogoljubov plays bishop to d2. Now, Reti comments that in these positions, white often has the initial advantage in that white often has slightly more space. In this instance, white still has the c4 pawn and it clearly has more control over the center. White's pieces are more forward. White has more space in this position. However, black's pawns still haven't really moved. The only pawn that has moved is this e6 pawn, if we ignore the c and d pawns. So black hasn't really committed to the center yet, and this may initially be that indicative that black's position is slightly worse. However, if you were to go into an endgame, then black's pawns not moving may not be that much of a bad thing. It may be more beneficial for an endgame if black was to go into an endgame now. Now here we see b6 by black. But Reti also comments that bishop takes c3 is an option, because after bishop takes c3, knight to e4, and white can't really keep both bishops. Obviously, the bishop goes to here, it could be taken. If it stays there, it could be taken. And if it goes there, be taken by the queen. So bishop b4 is the only option, but then knight to a6 can come. After bishop to a3, queen to a5 is devastating. Obviously, if the queen blocks its mate, so the only real move would be something like b4, but then knight takes b4, and you've got the threats of discovered attacks. You're a pawn down. Things aren't looking good here. So bishop takes c3 was another option, because knight to e4 would just win the bishop pair. However, Bogoljubov's opponent Wolf plays b6, which is still an okay move. There's nothing wrong with it. And we see e3, bishop to b7, bishop to e2, castles, castles, and now knight to a6. And Reti comments that black should really be trying to simplify the position. Black's pawns are slightly less committed. They haven't moved. He hasn't got as much space. So trying to simplify the position and trade off some pieces is beneficial to the person who has less space. And also, the fact his pawns haven't really moved is maybe a slight downside in the middle game, but in the end game, it's not really as much of a negative at all. And so Reti comments that knight c6 would have perhaps been better here instead. However, he says that black wants to try and play knight to c5 to essentially try and add more control over this e4 square. However, Reti is quite critical of this plan because white can simply play f3, and that would allow a huge amount of control over the e4 square, regardless of the amount of pieces black has attacking it. Now here we see a3, bishop to e7, rook to c1, knight to c5. So again, everything is eyeing up this e4 square, but f3. And now Reti stops here and evaluates the position again. He says that looking at the board, it's clear that black has less space, and all of black's pieces are sort of in each other's way. And therefore, black needs to try and break in the center to gain more space while he has the chance. And to do that, d5 is a potential option. However, Reti comments that an immediate d5 wouldn't really work, because after d5 he gives the variation of b3, then after knight to d7, c takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and now knight to c6, attacking the queen and the bishop, eventually forcing this bishop to take the knight, which would win the bishop pair. However, he does stop his variation here. I'm not too sure he quite looked far enough, because bishop takes a3 is a potential move, although after b4 this bishop may be getting a little bit trapped. The computer's not worried at all, but maybe a human would be, especially if they were looking at this position in their head from here. So d5 perhaps is sort of the ideal move which black wants to play, but it's not really possible. And black needs to try and break in the center because they have less space. So instead, black decides on trying to push e5. Now e5 is defending this f5 square, preventing knight f5. So black first of all plays g6 to prevent knight f5 after e5 is pushed. However, here white plays b4. Now this knight is pretty stuck. The only retreat square it can go is to a6. Everywhere else it will just be taken. And black doesn't want to retreat the knight to a6 at all. So instead we see e5 immediately. Because now if this knight retreats, this knight can go back to e6, and that would be what black would ideally want. Black wants to play knight to e6. Here, white exchanges on c5. We see an exchange on d4, takes on d4, and then takes on c5. And now we see d5 and d6. Now, if we examine this pawn structure now and compare it to perhaps here, this is where we last evaluated the position, we see that black hasn't. This is almost like one of the more hyper-modern openings where black hasn't really committed any of their pawns to the center. They've still got potential to try and push these pawns and break in the center if they need to. And so the position is quite dynamic still. However, if we compare it to here, we now see that with all of these separate pawn pushes, the game has changed. It was a hyper-modern opening where the central pawns hadn't moved that much, but now it's turned into a position which is far more known and far more concrete. It's far more aligned with the principles of Steinitz, and therefore the position can be evaluated a lot easier than before. And here Reti comments that white has a clear advantage. It's not a definitive advantage, but it is a definite advantage. It's not a game-winning advantage, it's a positional advantage. And this is due to white having more space in the center and black also having a weakened king side. Now, Reti comments that the most logical continuation to try and attack black's weakened king side would be something like f4, intending perhaps f5. However, he gives the continuation of bishop to c8, attacking this f5 square, preventing f5. So bishop to d3 and bishop to g4, possibly followed by queen to d7, just to try and defend everything. And Reti comments that in this position, black sort of managed to defend against white's attack. Black's got quite a few defenders of this f5 square as well. So, because of that, instead, Bogoljubov plays rook to b1. He's coordinating his pieces to attack on both sides of the board, although his eye is still on the king side. And we sort of see the beauty of rook b1, because what's black going to do with his bishop? Bishop to c8, it would give white a potential advantage on the queen side, especially after something like queen a4. White's able to get quite a lot of pressure on the queen side now. So instead, we see queen to d7, and this is what Bogoljubov likely predicted. However, the downside of this is that now f4 is possible, because bishop c8 is no longer really viable. Obviously, bishop c8, you can still play bishop to d3, and then we're still threatening to push f5. Now here we see rook f to b8, f5, bishop to c8, and now bishop to d3. We see queen to d8 and queen to f3. So we see how Bogoljubov is gradually building up all of his pieces. He's pushed his pawn, he's got it to where he wants it. Black obviously doesn't want to take and open up the king, so he's able to develop all of his pieces to improve his position further, to improve his attack further. We see rook takes b1, and now bishop takes b1. So Bogoljubov knows the attack on the king side is already very strong. He doesn't see the need to take on b1 with his rook, removing one of the attackers on the king side, because the attack on the king side currently is that strong, he doesn't really need to worry about the queen side. Now here, Wolf plays rook to b8. We see g4. And again, this is something I didn't really touch on at the time, but neither does Reti, but it's the same sort of thing which we've seen time and time again, where the center gets closed and the person, often with more space, is often able to try and get an attack on the wings. We saw Bogoljubov attack on the queen side, and then he attack on the queen side, and then he's starting to attack on the king side. And that's possible because the centre is closed. Rook to b2 was played, bishop c1, and now rook to b3. And now we see g5, attacking the knight. So knight to d7. Obviously everything is still defended. And now f takes g6. So Bogoljubov strikes at the king side. He's removed the defender of the king side and now he strikes at the king side. We see f takes g6, queen to f7 check, king h8, and now bishop takes g6. And Reti says that Bogoljubov likely saw this move, bishop takes g6, a few moves prior, perhaps even as far back as here, or even further back here. So he takes on g6. Now we comment that bishop c2 is perhaps a mistake. So the idea is that you can't take on c3 because of bishop to b2, which would be quite devastating. However, an immediate bishop to c2 doesn't work because of knight to e5. Because now, if we try and pass the move to black, now if rook takes on, oh well, actually no, the queen needs to move, doesn't it? So now let's say queen f2. Now if we take here, bishop to b2, it doesn't really do much because there is no pin. So in the game we saw bishop takes g6, and the reason we saw bishop takes g6 instead of bishop to b2 is because of this intermediate move, knight to e5, which attacks the queen and makes this attack on c3 far more relevant. So we see bishop takes g6, and we can sort of see why this move works, because in the game we see h takes g6, queen takes g6, and now queen to g8. I'm naturally going for a queen trade. Queen to h5 check. Queen h7 is the only move. After queen h6, this will be mate. So queen h7 is the only move. Queen to e8 check. And black's still trying to prevent mate with knight f8. And it doesn't look, black's king is very exposed, but black does have quite a few pieces defending the king, so it doesn't look disastrous at first glance, but it clearly is as well. Rook f7 is played next. So the queen retreats back to c2, looking for some form of counterattack. We see queen takes e7, queen takes c1 check, rook f1, and now we see rook takes c3. So the queen is pinning the rook to the king, and black has to sacrifice the queen for the rook, because if they do anything else, let's say they move the queen out the way, this would be mate. So black has to sacrifice the queen for the rook. So we see rook takes c3, queen takes f8, king h7, queen f7 check, king h8, rook takes c1, rook takes c1, and now king f2. And here black resigned. So white's got a queen for a bishop and a rook, except white has also got two pawns, and they're both pass pawns. And white's king is actually sort of fairly safe here. You know, white's only going to have so many. Sorry, black's only going to have so many checks, and this pawn is going to get to queen very quickly. So here, black resigned, and that's game number 52. And we saw just how the more hyper-modern opening here, where black hadn't committed any pawns to the center, it was still fairly dynamic position. How it turned into a far more fixed position after here, far more one which we can more accurately evaluate, and one which we've looked at quite a bit more, especially with the games of the older masters. And I anticipate we'll be seeing a few more examples like this within Bogoljubov's games. So if you like this game, please do like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.